The Great War, now better known as the First World War or World War One, lasted 4 long years. At the start, in 1914, everyone thought that it would be a short war, one in which their own side would emerge victorious. This romantic and naive image of the war was shattered within the first few weeks of the conflict. When this so-called war to end all wars ended, it left a total of 37 million casualties. Not all the people who fought in the war were infantry combat troops. There were many specialised groups that supported them. In this documentary, we are going to look at those auxiliary troops. Engineers. There was a huge demand for engineers during the First World War. They supported the main infantry and enabled it to move swiftly and efficiently by surveying, repairing bridges and roads, maintaining communication lines, removing landmines and booby traps, digging trenches and constructing shell, splinter and gas-proof shelters, providing clean water and setting up or removing barbed wire. They also built hospitals, barracks, mess halls, stables, target ranges and repaired train tracks. Because these responsibilities were so time-consuming, the engineers were not relied upon to fight at the front. The largest part of the engineers comprised the field and signals group. Each of these were attached to a fighting division, and they also participated in combat activities. The field groups were relied on for their everyday technical expertise. There were carpenters, blacksmiths, bricklayers, clerks, masons, painters, plumbers, surveyors, and many others. Many were engaged in activities that they pursued in their normal peacetime employment, but in this case they had to work in the front. They relied on horses for transportation. Because they saw fighting, almost all ranks were equipped with standard combat gear. The signalling groups were responsible for the communication between the troops at the front lines and the general headquarters or headquarters behind the lines. The first Special Forces units were made up from the engineers. They were formed to specialise in gas warfare, and after the first gas attacks had taken place, they began devising methods to counter the attacks. This extract of a diary describes the dangerous work of the engineers. It reads, "The 7th Division of Engineers laid the last bridge of the river under heavy shell and machine gun fire. Though standing in water up to their chins, they finished the job. When they were done with the work, they had to fight together with the infantry units." The Army Service Corps was responsible for supplying food and weaponry to the front line. It was organised into different companies, each fulfilling a specific role. Some were under direct orders, and others were attached to a division of the Army. The rest were under the direct orders of the higher command. There were both horse transport companies and mechanical transport companies, with the latter being mainly responsible for the transportation of heavy weapon and artillery. Lastly, there was also the Army Remount Service, companies responsible for providing horses to the front. During the First World War, the art of logistics changed dramatically. In the wars before, it was easier to keep an army supplied when it was moving than when it rested. For at rest, an army only consumed extra food and fuel. But in 1914, this idea was reversed. The scale of the war was much larger, and the enormous amount of supplies necessary made it more difficult for the supply lines to keep up with an advancing army. Many operations on both sides failed because it was very difficult to supply troops that had advanced too far. Hence, they often had to move back to their original positions. Later in the war, the British got the hang of it and started using tanks and motorised guns, not only in support of the advancing troops, but also to carry supplies in a more efficient way. Walt Disney joined the army at the end of the war when he was 16 by lying about his age. He signed up to be a volunteer ambulance driver for the Red Cross. He was sent to France, and he and his ambulance truck became known throughout the whole district. This was because, as Walt later remarked, I found out that the inside and outside of an ambulance is a good place to draw, and the ambulances of his unit could be recognised by the cartoons Walt Disney had drawn on them. While most people see trenches and the occasional charges into no man's land as the main element of World War I combat tactics, tunnels also played a big role. Both sides had teams of specialised mining engineers that would dig tunnels deep underground beneath enemy trenches. When the tunnels reached the other side, they would place mines consisting of tons of TNT and other explosives. After detonating the mine, they would follow it up by an infantry charge, in the hope of being able to capture the enemy position after the mine had blown it up. One of the most notable explosions was at the Battle of Massin in Belgium in 1917. The British had placed 455 tons of explosives in over 21 tunnels, which had taken more than a year to prepare. The huge explosion killed an estimated 10,000 Germans. It was said that the explosion could be heard and felt in London. Naturally, both sides also tried to discover enemy tunnels in order to protect their own trenches and prevent such massive casualties. They would tunnel across no man's land as well, but not all the way to the other side. They would stop and use different techniques to try and find enemy miners. One method used to discover tunnels was to push one end of a stick into the ground and hold the other end against your teeth to feel the vibrations. Another method was to sink a water-filled oil drum into the floor of the trench and put your ear in the water to hear the enemy tunnelling below. A lot of accounts describe the situation where German and Allied sappers encountered each other while digging tunnels. Usually this resulted in a bloody fight with knives and bayonets. It was also said that soldiers sometimes just saluted each other and then both went their separate ways. There were also situations in which both sides were in the same tunnel for days. Runners. Runners in World War I had the task of delivering messages from one point to another, although they also acted as reconnaissance observers and guides during battles. An infantryman chosen to be a runner did not only need speed and endurance, but he also had to have excellent map reading and reconnaissance skills. They had to get familiar with a certain part of the front and all its trenches, so that they could quickly lead new units to their correct positions in no man's land, and in the meantime help the old units to get out of it as quickly and safely as possible. When working on bigger tasks like moving entire platoons, they usually worked in pairs or larger groups. The young Adolf Hitler was a runner for the German side on the Western Front. He earned the Iron Cross for his bravery. Most historical accounts describe Hitler as one of the most heroic of soldiers. It is said that runners had the most dangerous work because they moved from trench to trench while being shelled. However, most accounts of that time are not reliable because they were altered or created by the Nazi regime in order to improve Hitler's reputation. In fact, runners had a relatively safe job because they spent most of the time between the front line and headquarters instead of in the line of fire. Priests. Army priests or chaplains played a very big role in World War I. They were not particularly needed in the frontline trenches, but when the troops saw an unarmed chaplain risking his life to get to them, they were very encouraged and felt that God would not abandon them. On Sundays, the chaplains tried to perform services for the men whenever it was possible, but because often most of the men were fighting, or because it was too dangerous, services did not take place often. The chaplains also tried to see the dead and wounded men giving them comfort and a proper farewell from the world when possible. An unknown chaplain was quoted in an edition of the London Times newspaper published during World War One. He wrote, "I can go where I like. I go to see the wounded when they are being brought back from the front, and to see if I am needed when gunners have been shelled. If necessary, I am ready to go to the firing line, but I should only be in the way in the daytime. I see the sick who come in daily and are sent off by the ambulances to a hospital or down country." Military police. During the Great War, soldiers needed an extra regime of discipline that would keep them in line. Therefore, the military police was established. Known generally as MPs, they basically did what normal police officers do during peacetime. But the MP performed his duties on the front and with the soldiers. Also, the punishments were much more severe because of the essence of obedience in war. Desertion was punishable by death. The duties of an MP were mainly traffic control of trucks and horses, dealing with crime committed by the soldiers on their side, control of civilians in the areas of war, handling prisoners of war, and patrolling ports and the rear end of the front. This extract from the book With Machine Gun to Cambrai, written by George Copard, highlights the type of ideology that could be found in the trenches when dealing with criminal matters. "I believe that an important modification of the death sentence also took place in 1917, wrote Copard. It appeared that the military authorities were compelled to take heed of the clamour against the death sentences being imposed by court-martial. There had been too many of them. As a result, a man who would otherwise have been executed was instead compelled to take part in the forefront of the first available raid or assault on the enemy. He was purposely placed in the first wave to cross no man's land, and it was left to the Almighty to decide his fate." Intelligence. When the war broke out, the intelligence systems of all sides were still very basic. Communications in the army did happen via radio, but they were not coded. This meant that the enemy could very easily overhear highly secretive information and so adjust their own tactics in such a way that they had a battle advantage. For this reason, coded communication was soon developed to counter these problems. The race between the code makers and the code breakers became such a big part of the war that in the end there were entire companies and national service divisions that worked with coded communications. Later, with the arrival of the Air Force, intelligence divisions started to make pictures of the enemy front lines from the air. This was used extensively to detect enemy troop movement and any other threats. Nigel de Grey was a codebreaker working for the British Codebreaking Department, Room 40, when he intercepted the so-called Zimmermann telegram, which was sent from Germany to Mexico on the 16th of January 1917. The telegram was highly secretive and contained an extremely complex form of encryption, but together with the Reverend William Montgomery, he was able to decode the telegram. Nigel de Grey found out that the German Foreign Secretary, Arthur Zimmermann, had transmitted the telegram. In it, he asked Mexico to become an ally of Germany, declare war on the United States, and invade the states of New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. Because of this telegram, the United States of America had no choice but to join the war, making it possible for the Allies to eventually defeat the Germans. Radio operators. Radio communications played a big role during World War I. At the time, it was known as wireless telegraphy, and it was used extensively by the military and naval forces of all nations. The Russian army also used wireless telegraphy to organize its movements, but it took insufficient precautions against interception and did not encode the information. Thanks to this oversight, the Germans won the decisive Battle of Tannenberg against the Russians in 1914, as they were able to eavesdrop on all of the Russian traffic. While the Germans may not have made as much use of this information as they could have, Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff probably knew as much about what the Russians were going to do as the Russians themselves did. However, radio interceptions also allowed radio deceptions to take place. In early September 1914, the Russians intercepted a message from German Army Staff Headquarters, which made them aware of a threat from a new large force, and therefore the Russians held back forces of their own from the upcoming battle. The Germans, however, had anticipated the interception and had transmitted a completely false message in the first place. Radio deception began to play its counterpoint to radio interception. Artillery troops. During the First World War, artillery forces grew to be one of the most important aspects of modern warfare. Before 1914, there were only a few field pieces on the battlefield. These inflicted about 15% of all casualties. By the end of the war, the artillery sections had grown so big that almost 3/4 of the casualties were being inflicted by large field guns. Tactics were altered so that the artillery could be effectively used. Most often, an extensive artillery barrage preceded an infantry charge, and there were attacks in which millions of shells were fired for days. So now you know that auxiliary troops played a vital role in World War I. You have seen in this documentary that they not only supported the infantry troops, but they also made a big difference during the key moments of the war. Although auxiliary troops will always remain in the background, they will continue to be truly irreplaceable.